Hey everyone, Flo from Off the Lens here, and today we're going to talk about exposure. Over the years, I've been asked quite often how I expose my footage shot with Blackmagic cameras, so I thought I would make this video and hopefully it will be interesting and helpful to you. I will discuss my process and how I monitor and expose, but also what I do in post that can help with the choices I made during production. And as always, before I start, be sure to subscribe to see more videos like this one, and let's get into it. This video is sponsored by B&H. As I just mentioned, I often get asked how I expose my Blackmagic footage, especially when it comes to low light and nighttime scenes. Over the past several years, I use pretty much every single Blackmagic camera and film very different projects in terms of genre, location, and overall style. But regardless of the type of content, whether it be documentary, commercial, travel, or personal, I've always been asked if I had any tips on exposure. So in today's video, I want to discuss my process when exposing, the tools that I use, and my reasoning behind some of my choices. I will also discuss the differences between exposing bright scenes and low light ones, the importance of breaking the rules for creative freedom, and I will also discuss the situations when we are sometimes forced to make a choice. I'll also be showing you some examples in DaVinci by using the false color effect, so you can get an idea on some of my previous shots and projects. It probably won't be exactly the same as what I saw on a monitor that day, but it should be pretty similar. The second part will be focused on post-production and what I do to my footage based on the way that I filmed and how it can have an impact on its final look and overall exposure. Also, please do keep in mind that this is based on my experience and how I do things personally. I'm not saying this is the best way to expose, this is simply my process and how I genuinely shoot, monitor, and make decisions. First of all, let's talk quickly about the gear. Of course, gear isn't always relevant to exposure, but in my case, it can be. As you probably know, I mostly use Blackmagic cameras. And based on which one I choose and the sensor, it can have a direct impact on how I expose. For example, the Pixis 12K and the OSA 12K LF have 16 stops of dynamic range, while some of the previous cameras have around 13 stops. More stops mean more flexibility or less restrictions when working in high contrast environments. Then we have the monitor. For the past few years, I've been using the dedicated OSA Cine monitor, and I'm a big fan of it. Aside from being bright and very useful in controlling the camera, it also provides an essential tool, and that is false color. I'll touch more on false color in a bit and how I actually use it. In addition to false color, there are also two other tools that I get by using the Blackmagic monitor, a histogram and zebras. Of course, you can also have these tools in other Blackmagic cameras directly on a built-in screen or with other monitors. But this is my current setup. Then I also use smaller accessories to help control and set my exposure. VNDs and internal NDs are very useful and a necessity with some cameras. For example, the OSA Cine 12K has internal NDs, which makes it very easy. But my two Pixis cameras and the Cinema Camera 6K don't have any, so I either use an external VND like the Nisi Swift, or I use my Mofash Poco 2, which essentially works as an internal ND system. Now let's get into the core of this video, but before that, here's a quick word about today's sponsor, B&H. I'm very proud and honored to have B&H as a sponsor for this channel in 2026. B&H is an institution when it comes to camera stores. I've been buying camera gear from them for more than 12 years now, and I visit the Superstore in New York City every chance I get. To this day, I order more than 100 items. I started getting some gear when I was back in Australia, and I still do it today, being based in French Alps. My first purchases were small accessories like memory cards, chargers, and pouches. Then when I grew as a filmmaker, I got things like lenses, matte boxes, monitors, stands, and desktop hard drives. I even bought my MacBook Air from there. Not only the selection of items is ridiculously large, but their shipping time is also incredible. And even if I live in Europe, I still end up buying items from B&H, as more often than not it ends up being cheaper and I also have stock. With this sponsored segment, I'm not offering anything or asking you guys to do anything specific, but if you do happen to need camera gear, of course feel free to use the links in the description. It doesn't cost you any more and it helps me to keep this channel going. Thanks again B&H for the support. Now back to the video. Of course, there are so many variables on set depending on the camera, light, lenses, and taste, but I will try my best to keep things general and focus on my own approach. As a note, I always try to shoot at a native ISO. This can mean 400 or 800 depending on the camera. I will only go higher if needed during a low light scene. Now let's talk about tools. Regardless of the project, I often monitor my footage in a similar way and use the same tools. False color is one of the best tools to gauge exposure and the one that I use the most. In my case, it helps me get a quick glance and saves me a lot of time. This is extremely useful in documentary settings or for outdoor content or simply when time is limited. Every system is different and I have used a few, but now I'm very much used to the one in Blackmagic cameras as I find it very simple to use and easy to read. More often than not, I will keep or put what is the most important part of the image or where I want to focus the viewer's eyes on in green. It can be a person, a building, a flower, anything really. And the same happens for very bright scenes. I often shoot in the snow, and I always make sure to aim for that green. This is the first part of my process, and it usually works very well. Then I want to also make sure that I'm not losing any detail, so I will avoid any highlights in red and if possible, yellow. And the same goes for the other end of the spectrum, where I will avoid magenta and blue as much as possible. If I happen to have a camera with two monitors, like the Ursa Cine lineup, I will often have one always set to false color. If not, I will assign it to one of the custom buttons so I can easily turn it on and off. In combination with false color, I also check my histogram and make sure that the whole image sits in between, or at least towards the middle. Having the little red lights on the right really helps to visually have a cue when things get a little too hot, for example. Personally, I always tend to see my image more on the left side of the histogram. If for some reason I cannot get the part of the image that I want in green, or if I need the image to be clean and neither overexposed or underexposed, I will work my way up or down depending on the scene. In bright conditions, I often start from the high end of the histogram on the right and will slowly adjust the aperture or my NDs until I see no red or yellow in false color. In very dark environments, I will usually be on the left side and try my best to lift the whole image either via the aperture or ISO and try to limit the blue or pink as much as possible. Then I also have my zebras, set to a certain amount depending on the shots. It could be 90% or less, and it really depends on the scene. This is something I don't always use, but zebras can be quite useful, even just for peace of mind. Most of the time, I use them to double check the sky. When you shoot outdoor content as much as I do, you tend to rely on these tools as the ambient light can be quite intense and can make it hard to properly gauge what your image is actually doing in terms of exposure. Things can feel very bright around you when there aren't as much in camera, or vice versa. This is when tools can give you a more accurate reading. Of course, when you have control over your light and your scenes, then it can be much easier to compensate and adjust things to your liking. Something I always get asked is how did I get clean shadows? And my answer is often the same, because I didn't try to save them. I wanted my shadows to be black, either because they actually were, or because it was a creative choice. A correct exposure can mean something in terms of the levels or purely from the camera's point of view, but as a filmmaker we can also bend and break those rules to steer away from what is supposed to be technically right. After all, shadows are dark and highlights are bright. I actually don't mind when a movie or TV show has overexposed windows, because this happens in real life. I really like having 16 stops of dynamic range, but it doesn't mean that every single shot needs to be within the range. I do like contrast and for things to look natural if needed.
Technically this is starting to get overexposed. You can see here's a bit of yellow. But if I put myself here, this technically is not overexposed. However, this is not my kind of image. If I was shooting this, I would probably go here, like I was saying, putting the green. And this is the image that I would end up with. Slightly under, but I much prefer this than to go all the way here, even though it's technically correct. To me, something like that looks a lot nicer.
In some cases, you might have to make a more definitive choice when it comes to exposure, and this happens to me a lot. Some scenes will be extremely bright, and you will have to either lose some detail in the highlights, or some in the shadows. For example, if you are shooting in a very dark place with bright windows pouring light in, or if you are outside in a full daylight in a city, you will most likely not be able to retain both ends of the spectrum. You will have to decide what is more important to you or the shot, especially if there is absolutely no way to compensate for it either way. In a controlled environment, you might be able to work around these issues and compensate with either fixtures or modifiers by adding or taking light away. In a natural setting, you might have to decide on the spot or to try to find solutions to limit the impact. For example, you can move around, or find a new angle, or might have to move your subject entirely. Making sure you actually capture the correct image during production is of course the most important part, but it can also help and confirm your decisions with a final look in post. In my case, this often comes down to two things: noise reduction and overall contrast. What ISO I shot in and how did I get clean shadows is something that I get asked all the time, and I actually mentioned that in a few videos already. These days we can actually shoot RAW in camera, which can obviously be a huge help in post. For example, ISO doesn't have to be set in stone anymore. Let's talk about noise reduction first. Usually, I use it to get rid of some noise in low light or nighttime scenes. This is the case for a lot of my travel videos, for example. And contrary to what people think, I actually very rarely raise my ISO. I shoot most of my low light scenes at 400 or 1250, because as I mentioned before, I want the dark scenes to look dark because they were. And I'm not saying that my scenes are all dark, I always make sure to have pockets of light to balance the overall image. This is again when creativity takes over what is considered correct. My false color might show a lot of blue and magenta, but this is what I intended. Now, Blackmagic cameras are not known to be low light monsters, but that doesn't stop me from shooting in very low light, even with traditional zooms, which are definitely not fast lenses. For example, I shoot most of my travel nighttime scenes at f4. Yes, my image is going to be noisy, but this is when noise reduction comes into play. I do all of my noise reduction in DaVinci Resolve, and my general settings for 90% of my low light shots are 5 frames, beta, and a luma will sit anywhere between 5 and 8 when noise reduction isn't too much needed, or between 10 and 15 when the footage is quite noisy. This is all I do. Contrast is another way to make sure that your image looks correctly exposed, either from a technical point of view or from a creative one. For example, I often like to have a silhouette look in my videos. This can be for documentary, commercial, or travel content. It allows me to shoot lower and to preserve the highlights. I want my images to have depth, and I find contrast can help a lot in achieving this. This can be done at blue hour, nighttime, or in full daylight. When I shoot, I keep that in mind, and I know that even if I go slightly too low in my shadows, I will end up adding more contrast to lean into it. I add contrast by either using a contrast effect, and more often than not, by using the curve. Personally, I always prefer an image slightly under than too high. I would always prioritize saving highlights over shadows unless the scene or project needs something different. Again, I feel that images are about balance and depth. And whilst exposure has a technical element to it, and there can be a right and wrong approach and result, I believe that each filmmaker and project is different, and that everyone has their own style and preferences, so exposure is something to be aware of and something essential to control, but it is also something that can be flexible and adjusted. That's it for me for today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that it was helpful to you, and if you did, feel free to subscribe. And also let me know how you expose your footage and what your preferences are. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Also, feel free to check out my 2 ebooks, Freelance Documentary Filmmaking and Travel Cinematography, where you can find a streamlined but comprehensive overview from pre-production all the way to marketing, built on years of my own experience shooting short documentaries and travel videos around the world. And if you are interested, I'm also doing filmmaking mentoring sessions when you can ask me anything about a wide variety of topics.